The words were soft, delivered with a smile, but the warning in them was clear as crystal. It wasn't a suggestion or a casual remark, but a directive that carried consequences if ignored. James seemed to understand this perfectly, his expression serious as he rose to shake Dominic's hand. "I will," James promised, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he meant it. Something had changed in her husband tonight. Some understanding had dawned about both the woman he had married and the family she came from. Dominic straightened, adjusting his tie with a subtle movement. "The dinner is taken care of," he told Richard, gesturing vaguely toward the front of the restaurant where Giuseppe could be seen hovering attentively. "Consider it my anniversary gift to the happy couple." "That's not necessary," Richard began, his hand moving reflexively toward the inside pocket of his jacket where he kept his wallet. The gesture was pure instinct, the automatic response of a man accustomed to controlling situations through financial means. "I insist," Dominic said firmly, his tone making it clear that any further discussion would be unwelcome. "We'll see you Sunday, 4 o'clock. Dress casually." The command was delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. With a final nod to the table, he rejoined his associates and made his way out of the restaurant, stopping to speak briefly with Giuseppe on his way out. The older man nodded repeatedly, his demeanor deferential as he listened to whatever instructions Dominic was delivering. A collective breath seemed to be released at the table as the door closed behind them. The ambient noise of the restaurant gradually returned to normal, as if the entire establishment had been holding its breath during Dominic's visit, and only now felt safe to resume regular conversation. "Well," Elizabeth said, her voice higher than usual as she reached for her water glass with a hand that trembled visibly, "your brother seems devoted to you." The understatement was so absurd that Sarah almost laughed aloud. Instead, she sipped her wine, the exquisite Brunello that tasted of history and family and complicated legacies, unsure whether to be mortified or amused by the entire situation. "Dominic is very protective," she said simply, deciding that elaborate explanations would serve no purpose. "He always has been. You never mentioned your family was so connected," William said, unable to keep the nervous awe from his voice. The arrogance that had defined his demeanor throughout dinner had evaporated, replaced by something approaching respect as he looked at Sarah with new eyes. "You never asked," Sarah replied, the words coming out sharper than she had intended. 2 years of subtle condescension and dismissal had built up a reservoir of resentment that was now finding release. "You were too busy talking about your golf handicap and your summer house in the Hamptons and your friends from Harvard to ever ask a single meaningful question about my family or my background." The bluntness of her response seemed to shock the Caldwells as much as Dominic's presence had. They were accustomed to Sarah's deference, her careful attempts to fit into their world, despite their less than welcoming attitudes. This new assertiveness was clearly unexpected. James let out a startled laugh, quickly covering it with a cough when his mother shot him a shocked look. The sound was genuine, however, appreciation for this previously unseen side of his wife. Sarah caught the flash of admiration in his eyes and felt something shift between them, a rebalancing that felt long overdue. "Sarah," Elizabeth began reprovingly, reflexively reaching to reassert control over a situation that was rapidly slipping beyond her influence. Her tone carried the weight of generations of social conditioning, the kind of quiet authority that had likely silenced countless discussions at Boston dinner parties when topics became uncomfortable. "I think," James interrupted, surprising everyone at the table, including Sarah, "that we owe Sarah an apology, all of us." He looked directly at his mother, his usual deference replaced by a quiet determination. "We haven't been welcoming or respectful, and that changes today." The silence that followed his declaration was profound. Richard cleared his throat, the familiar sound now carrying a note of discomfort rather than authority. "James is right. Sarah, we may have misjudged some things." The careful wording was typical of Richard, who had built his career on diplomatic language that committed to little while appearing conciliatory. Sarah could see the calculation behind Richard's eyes, the sudden revaluation of her worth now that he understood her family connections. It wasn't genuine respect born of appreciating her as a person, but rather fear and pragmatic reassessment in light of new information. It was not the acceptance she had once craved, but Sarah found that she no longer needed their approval as desperately as she once had. The revelation was surprisingly liberating. "I appreciate that, Richard," she said, maintaining the formal address that Elizabeth had always insisted upon rather than the more intimate Dad that James used with his father. "And I look forward to all of you joining us for Sunday dinner. My mother is a wonderful cook, and family means everything to her." She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she added with deliberate emphasis, "Everything." The unspoken implication hung in the air. Rosa Ricci was as formidable in her own way as Dominic, though her power came through different channels. Her fierce devotion to family, her unyielding standards, and her old-world values would be as challenging for the Caldwells to navigate as Dominic's more obvious authority. The waiter approached with their appetizers, moving with the careful precision of someone who had been warned to provide impeccable service. "Compliments of Mr. Ricci," he said, as he set down an additional plate of calamari that hadn't been ordered. The perfectly fried rings were arranged artfully around a center of lemon wedges and a small bowl of marinara sauce that Sarah suspected was made from Giuseppe's closely guarded family recipe. James raised his wineglass, the crystal catching the light as he held it aloft. "To family," he said, looking directly at Sarah with new understanding in his eyes. The simple toast carried layers of meaning, acknowledgement, apology, and perhaps a promise of change. "To family," the others echoed, their voices subdued but sincere. Even William managed to meet Sarah's eyes as he raised his glass, a grudging respect replacing his earlier condescension. Sarah raised her own glass, thinking of her brother driving back to Providence with his associates, of her mother, who would be simultaneously delighted and critical of hosting the Caldwells, despite what Sarah had told her about them, of her father who had worked himself to exhaustion to provide opportunities for his children. She thought of the complex web of obligations, loyalties, and expectations that defined her birth family, so different from the sterile social calculations of the Caldwells. To family, she agreed, in all its complicated forms. On the evening of June 23rd in Boston's North End, Sarah Ricci stood frozen as her husband's family ridiculed her Italian accent and working-class background during what should have been a joyful anniversary dinner at Pellegrino's restaurant. 28-year-old Sarah, a kindergarten teacher from Providence, felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as the wealthy Caldwell family laughed openly at her mispronunciation of the wine list. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 15 degrees when the restaurant door swung open and her older brother Dominic, whom she had deliberately not invited, appeared with 3 stone-faced associates in matching black suits. The Caldwells' laughter died instantly when Dominic, the most feared underboss in the Rhode Island criminal organization, placed a gentle kiss on Sarah's forehead before turning his attention to her in-laws. This is the story of how one dinner transformed the relationship between 2 families forever. Subscribe now to discover how blood ties and chosen family collide in a single night that would redefine respect, power, and acceptance. The crystal chandeliers of Pellegrino's cast a warm, golden glow over the restaurant's interior, their light reflecting off the polished silver and fine china arranged meticulously on the tables. The air was rich with the aromas of garlic, basil, and simmering tomato sauce, scents that reminded Sarah Ricci Caldwell of Sunday afternoons in her mother's kitchen in Providence. Yet despite the familiar comforts, Sarah's stomach twisted with anxiety as she sat surrounded by her husband's family. She nervously smoothed the fabric of her navy blue dress, the nicest one she owned, purchased specifically for this occasion, and tried to ignore the subtle looks exchanged between her husband's family members. 2 years of marriage to James Caldwell had not made these family gatherings any easier. If anything, they had become more difficult as the initial politeness of welcoming a new member had worn off, revealing the Caldwells' true feelings about their youngest son's choice of bride. Tonight's anniversary dinner felt particularly tense, with each glance and comment carrying undercurrents of disapproval that Sarah had become expert at detecting. The maitre d' had seated them at the best table in the house, a corner spot with a view of the entire restaurant and the twinkling lights of Boston's North End visible through the window. Sarah knew it was the Caldwell name that had secured such prime placement. The Caldwell name opened doors throughout Boston, a reality that still felt foreign to Sarah, who had grown up in a world where respect was earned through personal connections and family loyalty, rather than wealth and social standing. "Sarah, darling," Elizabeth Caldwell, her mother-in-law, called from across the table, her voice carrying a sweetness that never quite reached her eyes. Elizabeth was a vision of Boston Brahmin perfection in her tailored Chanel suit, her silver blonde hair arranged in a style that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly teacher's salary. The 3-carat diamond on her left hand caught the light as she reached for her water glass. "Perhaps you could tell everyone that charming story about how you grew up, the one about your father's, what was it? Delicatessen." The way Elizabeth said delicatessen made it sound like a particularly distasteful medical condition. Sarah felt her cheeks warm as 5 pairs of eyes turned toward her expectantly. Besides James and his parents, William and Vanessa Caldwell were present, completing the tableau of old Boston money that made Sarah feel perpetually out of place. "It was a grocery store, Mother Caldwell," she replied quietly, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite her discomfort. "Ricci's Market. My father imported specialty items from Italy, olive oils, wines, cheeses that you couldn't find anywhere else in Rhode Island at the time." She felt a flicker of pride as she added, "People would drive from all over New England to shop there. He passed away 5 years ago." She didn't mention how her father had worked 18-hour days for decades, how his hands had been permanently stained from handling olives and red wines, how he had put both his children through college on a grocer's earnings. The Caldwells wouldn't understand the dignity of that kind of labor. "Oh yes, that's right, so quaint." Elizabeth's smile remained fixed as she turned to her husband. "Richard, remember when we visited that neighborhood once? So authentic." The way she pronounced authentic made it sound like a disease. James squeezed Sarah's hand under the table but remained silent. Her husband was caught perpetually in the middle, loving his wife but unwilling to challenge his family's subtle disdain. At 32, James was the youngest Caldwell son, the artistic one with soulful eyes and an architect's sensitivity, who had disappointed his father by pursuing design instead of finance. His firm specialized in historical preservation, a compromise that had partially appeased his parents, as it at least kept him working with the type of wealthy clients the Caldwells considered appropriate company. Meeting and falling in love with Sarah, a kindergarten teacher from a working-class Italian family in Providence, had only widened the gap between him and his parents. Sarah sometimes caught James looking at her with a mixture of love and apology, as if he were constantly sorry for the world he had brought her into. "Let's order some wine," James suggested, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who had spent a lifetime mediating family tensions. He signaled for the waiter with a discreet gesture that spoke of generations of privilege. William Caldwell, James's older brother by 5 years, leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Where James was lean and thoughtful, William was broad-shouldered and direct, the perfect heir to the Caldwell financial empire, with his business degree from Harvard and strategic marriage to Vanessa, a former debutante whose family connections had been deemed suitable by Elizabeth and Richard. "Excellent idea, little brother," William said, checking his Patek Philippe watch, as if wine selection were a business meeting that needed to be efficiently managed. Something appropriate for the occasion. The wine list arrived, bound in leather and extensive enough to be intimidating. The sommelier, a trim man with salt and pepper hair and a professional demeanor, presented it with a slight bow. James passed it to Sarah with a small smile of encouragement, knowing her family's background had given her more knowledge about Italian wines than anyone at the table. "Perhaps you could select something, Sarah," Richard Caldwell suggested, his voice carrying the same measured authority he likely used in boardrooms. At 68, Richard maintained the commanding presence that had helped him expand Caldwell Financial from a respected local institution to a regional powerhouse. His steel-gray hair was perfectly trimmed, his navy suit clearly tailored to disguise the slight paunch he had developed in recent years. "I understand Italians know their wines. The comment might have been innocent from someone else, but Sarah had learned to hear the subtle insinuations in Richard's statements. This was not a compliment, but another test, another opportunity for her to reveal herself as an outsider. Still, she accepted the list with a practiced smile, determined not to show how much these interactions affected her. Sarah began to review the selections, her trained eye scanning for regions and producers she recognized from her father's store. Her anxiety made her stumble over the pronunciation of a particular Montepulciano d'Abruzzo from a producer with a particularly complex name. William snickered audibly, exchanging a look with Vanessa that made Sarah's confidence waver further. "Sorry, what was that? Montepulci what?" William's voice carried just enough for neighboring tables to hear, causing Sarah's embarrassment to deepen. Vanessa joined in with a tinkling laugh that made Sarah's skin crawl, adjusting her designer dress as if to highlight the contrast between her polished appearance and Sarah's more modest attire. "It's actually a lovely region in Tuscany," Sarah tried to explain, keeping her voice level despite the knot forming in her throat. She remembered her father's patient voice as he taught her about the wines of his homeland, pointing to places on a worn map of Italy that hung in the store's back office. "The wine is made from Sangiovese grapes primarily, and this particular producer is known for their traditional methods that—" "Maybe we should stick to something you can pronounce," Elizabeth interrupted with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her pearl necklace gleamed in the restaurant's soft lighting, a family heirloom that had once belonged to a Caldwell grandmother who, as Elizabeth had mentioned multiple times, had been presented at court to the King of England. "Waiter, we'll take the Cabernet." The waiter nodded uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension at the table. Sarah folded her hands in her lap to hide their slight trembling, focusing on the familiar weight of her grandmother's gold wedding band, the only piece of jewelry she wore besides her own modest engagement ring. She felt the familiar burning shame she experienced at every Caldwell gathering, the sense of being perpetually measured and found wanting. James's hand tightened around hers under the table, a silent apology. Sarah wished, not for the first time, that his support wasn't always hidden. Beneath tables, behind closed doors, in private moments away from his family's scrutiny. Just once, she wanted him to defend her openly, to challenge the subtle cruelty that his family had elevated to an art form. "So, how's the kindergarten, Sarah?" Richard asked, swirling the water in his glass as if it were a fine scotch. His tone suggested teaching 5-year-olds was barely a step above unemployment in the Caldwell hierarchy of acceptable occupations. "Still enjoying playing with finger paints and teaching the alphabet? Or have you considered James's suggestion about private school positions?" The question came loaded with subtext. James had never suggested Sarah look for positions at private schools. That had been Richard and Elizabeth's not-so-subtle hint that her current job at a public elementary school in a working-class Boston neighborhood was embarrassing to them. Just another way in which she failed to meet the Caldwell standard. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, to explain the rewards of early childhood education and the joy she found in helping shape young minds, when the heavy wooden door of the restaurant swung open with a decisive force that somehow commanded attention from across the room. Sarah's heart stopped. She recognized the 4 men who had just entered, without having to turn around. The lead figure, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair slicked back, surveyed the room with practiced ease. Dominic Ricci, her older brother, whom she had deliberately not invited tonight. Behind him stood 3 men Sarah recognized as his closest associates, their expressions impassive, their posture alert. Dominic was 9 years older than Sarah and had taken over their father's legitimate business after his death. But the grocery store was now just a front for his other activities, the ones their mother pretended not to know about, the ones Sarah had been trying to distance herself from since college, the ones that had made him the most feared underboss in the Rhode Island organization. The restaurant owner, an older Italian man with salt and pepper hair named Giuseppe Pellegrino, rushed forward from where he had been chatting with patrons to greet Dominic personally. His entire demeanor transformed from the dignified restaurant proprietor to an old-world Italian showing deference to someone of great importance. He clasped Dominic's hand in both of his own, speaking rapid Italian that Sarah could partially understand from her childhood lessons, expressions of honor, welcome, and assurances that the best table would be prepared immediately. Dominic responded in equally fluent Italian, his accent flawless in a way that Sarah had never quite managed to achieve despite their shared upbringing. His voice was warm and respectful to the older man, conveying genuine appreciation rather than the condescension such a man might receive from someone like Richard Caldwell. Several diners nodded deferentially as Dominic passed their tables, a few rising slightly from their seats in a gesture of respect that spoke volumes about her brother's standing. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar mixture of love, pride, and dismay that her brother always evoked in her. She had intentionally selected Pellegrino's because it was in Boston, not Providence, because it was in the North End, where the old Italian families knew each other, but maintained a respectful distance from affairs in Rhode Island, because it was outside her brother's usual territory, because she had wanted just one night without the shadow of her family's connections hanging over her, one evening where she could pretend she was simply Sarah Caldwell, kindergarten teacher and loving wife, rather than Sarah Ricci, daughter of Antonio and sister of Dominic. James leaned closer. His cologne, an expensive sandalwood blend she had given him for his birthday, filling her senses as he whispered, "Is that—" "Yes," Sarah whispered back, her fingers tightening around her water glass. "My brother." The Caldwells, oblivious to the sudden shift in the restaurant's mood and the significance of the new arrivals, continued their conversation, with William now regaling the table with a story about a recent golf trip to Pebble Beach that had somehow turned into a commentary on new money and those who would never understand the proper social graces required at elite country clubs. Dominic spotted Sarah immediately, his dark eyes, so similar to her own that people often remarked on the strong Ricci genetics, taking in the scene with a single comprehensive sweep. She watched his gaze catalogue every detail. Her tense posture, with shoulders drawn tight beneath her blue dress, the smug expressions of her in-laws who continued talking as if they were the only important people in the room, the nervous way James kept glancing between his wife and his family, as if trying to calculate the precise diplomatic response to this unexpected situation. Dominic's expression didn't change, his features remaining arranged in the pleasant mask he wore in public. But Sarah knew that look. It was the calm that preceded a storm. She remembered seeing that same expression when she was 12, and a boy at school had made her cry by mocking her homemade lunch of prosciutto and provolone on crusty Italian bread, so different from the peanut butter sandwiches her classmates brought. Dominic, then 21, and already developing a reputation in the neighborhood, had appeared outside her school that afternoon. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, but 3 days later the boy had approached Sarah with a black eye and a sincere apology. He approached their table now with measured steps, his movements conveying both casual ease and absolute command of the space around him. Sarah noticed how other diners tracked his progress through the restaurant, conversations pausing momentarily as he passed. His 3 associates hung back at a respectful distance, positioning themselves strategically near the entrance, their relaxed postures belying their constant vigilance. "Sarah," he said, his voice betraying nothing but warm affection as he leaned down to kiss her cheek, his familiar scent of expensive cologne and just the faintest trace of tobacco enveloping her. His hand on her shoulder was gentle, at odds with the power she knew those hands possessed. "What a surprise to find you here." The lie rolled smoothly from his lips, practiced and convincing. Sarah knew there was no coincidence in his appearance. In their family there were no accidents, no random encounters, particularly not where Dominic was concerned. Someone, probably their cousin Marco, who worked as a valet at several high-end restaurants throughout Boston, as part of Dominic's intelligence network, had spotted her Caldwell in-laws entering Pellegrino's and made a call. Or perhaps Giuseppe himself had recognized the Caldwell name from the reservation and informed Dominic that his sister would be dining there tonight. "Dominic," she managed, rising from her seat, her hands automatically smoothing her dress in a nervous gesture she had never quite overcome. "I didn't expect to see you." Their eyes met in a silent exchange that spoke volumes, the kind of wordless communication they had perfected growing up in a household where certain things remained unspoken. Her gaze asked, "Why are you here?" His replied, "You know exactly why." His smile was gentle for her, though his eyes remained calculating as they shifted to take in the Caldwells, who had finally noticed the disruption to their evening. "I had some business in the city. Thought I'd grab dinner." He turned his attention to the table, his gaze settling on James. "You must be the husband. We met at the wedding but haven't had much time to get acquainted since then." James stood, extending his hand with only the slightest hesitation that someone less observant than Dominic might have missed. To his credit, he didn't flinch when Dominic shook it, though Sarah noticed a slight widening of his eyes as he processed her brother's firm grip and the unmistakable aura of authority that surrounded him. Her husband had met Dominic only twice before, once at their engagement dinner, where Dominic had been on his best behavior for Sarah's sake, and at their small wedding, where his presence had been deliberately downplayed at Sarah's insistence. James knew, in the abstract way of someone who has heard stories but never experienced the reality, what her brother did for a living. But knowing and understanding were very different things. "James Caldwell," he introduced himself, his architect's eye taking in the details of Dominic's appearance with new awareness. "Good to see you again, Dominic. Sarah didn't mention you'd be joining us." She didn't know. Dominic replied with an easy smile that revealed just a hint of the straight white teeth that Sarah knew had cost their father a small fortune in orthodontist bills. "I should have called ahead, but when I heard my baby sister was celebrating her anniversary, I wanted to surprise her." The familiar nickname he had called her baby sister since they were children, despite her protests that it made her sound like an infant, carried a warmth that only Sarah would recognize as partly genuine, partly performance. Dominic nodded, then turned his attention to the rest of the table. Sarah watched as his gaze assessed each Caldwell in turn, cataloguing details with the precision of someone whose survival had often depended on reading people quickly and accurately. His eyes lingered briefly on Elizabeth's pearl necklace, on Richard's custom cufflinks, on the subtle signals of old wealth that the Caldwells wore as comfortably as their own skin. "And you must be James's family. Sarah has mentioned you." His tone gave nothing away about what exactly Sarah might have mentioned, though in reality she had told him plenty during their weekly phone calls, conversations that always ended with her insisting she was fine, that she could handle the Caldwells' subtle disdain on her own, that she didn't need her big brother to fight her battles anymore. Richard Caldwell, ever the businessman with decades of experience reading potential clients and competitors, recovered first from the unexpected interruption to their evening. He rose partially from his chair in a gesture that attempted to reclaim some semblance of control over the situation. "Richard Caldwell," he said, extending his hand with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "This is my wife Elizabeth, our son William, and his wife Vanessa. We're celebrating Sarah and James's anniversary." Sarah noticed how her father-in-law emphasized "our son," and "we're celebrating," as if to establish territorial rights over the evening and by extension over her and James. It was a subtle power play that would have worked with almost anyone else, but Sarah knew her brother had been navigating far more dangerous situations than a tense family dinner since he was a teenager. 2 years, Elizabeth added quickly, as though the length of the marriage was somehow significant, perhaps suggesting it was still in a probationary period, not yet a permanent addition to the Caldwell legacy. Dominic's smile didn't reach his eyes as he shook Richard's hand. His expression remained pleasant, but Sarah could see the slight tightening around his mouth that signaled his growing dislike for her in-laws. Only 2 years. The way Sarah speaks of James, I would have thought they'd been together forever. The compliment hung in the air, simultaneously warm toward James and subtly challenging to the Caldwells. Dominic turned to the waiter who had appeared nervously at his elbow, a young man with dark hair and olive skin who had probably been warned by Giuseppe about the importance of the new arrival. "Would you bring another chair? I'd like to join my sister's celebration if the family doesn't mind." It wasn't a question, and everyone at the table understood that. Even Richard Caldwell, who Sarah suspected hadn't heard the word no directed at him in decades, seemed to recognize that objecting would be both futile and potentially unwise. The waiter rushed to comply, returning seconds later with a chair that was wedged between Sarah and Elizabeth. The proximity would force Elizabeth to interact directly with Dominic, a positioning choice that Sarah knew was deliberate on her brother's part. Dominic settled into the chair with easy grace, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a casual gesture that nonetheless drew attention to its perfect tailoring. Sarah had always marveled at her brother's ability to move between worlds. He could be equally comfortable in their mother's modest kitchen in Providence, in the back rooms of social clubs where business was conducted away from prying eyes, or in high-end restaurants like Pellegrino's. He had an innate understanding of power that transcended social class, a knowledge that true authority came from something deeper than wealth or social position. "We were just about to order wine," Richard said, clearly trying to regain control of the situation and re-establish himself as the patriarch of the gathering. "Excellent." Dominic signaled the waiter with a subtle gesture that brought not just their server, but the sommelier hurrying to the table. "Bring us a bottle of the 2015 Brunello di Montalcino from Poggio di Sotto." He glanced at Sarah with a small smile that carried genuine warmth. "Still your favorite, right?" Sarah nodded, touched despite her anxiety about Dominic's presence. It was indeed her favorite, a wine their father had introduced her to on her 21st birthday. They had sat together in the back room of Ricci's market after closing, where Antonio Ricci had solemnly explained the traditions of the Montalcino region, the patient aging process, and the way the Sangiovese grape captured the essence of the Tuscan hills. "Wine is history in a bottle," he had told her, his English still carrying the accent of his Tuscan childhood despite 50 years in America. "When you drink it, you taste not just fruit and oak, but time and tradition. That particular vintage from Poggio di Sotto cost several $100s and wasn't even on the menu here, but would somehow materialize because Dominic had asked for it." Sarah wondered briefly what favor Giuseppe Pellegrino owed her brother, what connection existed between them that would make such a request immediately fulfilled. "Actually," William began, his voice carrying the entitled tone of someone unused to being contradicted, "we were going to order—" "Trust me," Dominic interrupted smoothly, his voice pleasant but with a steel undertone that silenced William mid-sentence. "You'll enjoy this much more. It's from a small producer, hard to find in the States. My father imported it exclusively for years." His tone made it clear the matter was settled, the decision made without need for debate or discussion. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Sarah could see the Caldwells recalibrating their understanding of the situation, their quick glances and subtle shifts in posture, revealing their growing awareness that the dynamics they had taken for granted had suddenly changed. They might not know the specifics of Dominic's business, but people like the Caldwells always had a sixth sense about power. And everything about Dominic radiated it, not the positional authority that came with Richard's banking title or the social standing represented by Elizabeth's family connections, but something more primal and absolute. Elizabeth shifted slightly away from Dominic, her perfectly manicured hand fidgeting with her pearls in a nervous gesture. William kept glancing toward the door where Dominic's associates maintained their silent vigilance. Vanessa studied her plate, as if the fine china had suddenly become fascinating. Only James seemed relatively composed, though Sarah could feel the tension in his hand where it rested against hers under the table. "So what business brings you to Boston, Mr. Ricci?" Richard finally asked, his voice professionally curious with just the right note of deference, the tone he likely used with important clients or influential board members. He was attempting to gather information, to understand exactly who and what he was dealing with. "Just Dominic, please," her brother replied with practiced charm that could disarm even the wariest individual. "We're family, after all." He took a breadstick from the basket, breaking it in half with strong, precise fingers that bore a small scar across the knuckles, a souvenir from a fight in his youth that Sarah still remembered bandaging. "I'm expanding some of our import operations, specialty foods, wines, olive oils. The market for authentic Italian products is growing." Sarah suppressed a grimace. The import operations were real enough, their father's legitimate legacy, but they now served as a convenient cover for Dominic's other activities. He caught her eye and winked, the gesture so reminiscent of their childhood that Sarah felt a pang of nostalgia for the protective older brother who had taught her to ride a bike and threatened any boy who made her cry. The wine arrived with remarkable speed, presented by the sommelier himself rather than their regular waiter. He showed the bottle to Dominic, who nodded in approval. "We're honored to have you dining with us, Mr. Ricci," the sommelier said as he uncorked the bottle. "Your father was a good friend to my family." "Antonio was a good friend to many," Dominic replied, a genuine warmth in his voice. He would be happy to see his daughter celebrating her anniversary in such a fine establishment. The sommelier poured a taste for Dominic, who surprised the Caldwells by deferring to Sarah with a gesture of respect that contradicted their perception of Italian patriarchal traditions. "My sister has the better palate," he said, the statement carrying both truth and a subtle message about her worth. "Always has since we were kids. She could identify regions just from smelling the cork by the time she was 15. Sarah accepted the glass with practiced ease, swirling the ruby liquid with the expertise of someone who had grown up around fine wines, despite her modest background. She brought the glass to her nose, inhaling the complex aromas of dark cherries, leather, and subtle earthiness, before taking a small sip. The rich flavors transported her instantly to Sunday dinners at their parents' house, the worn wooden table covered with dishes of pasta, platters of cured meats, and baskets of bread. Her father would hold court at the head of the table, pouring small amounts of wine for his children. Illegal, perhaps, but part of a cultural education he considered essential, teaching them about the wines of his homeland with the reverence of passing down sacred knowledge. "It's perfect," she said softly, the simple words carrying the weight of those memories. The wine was poured for everyone with ceremonial precision, the sommelier working his way around the table in order of perceived importance. Dominic first, then Sarah as his blood relative, then James as her husband, before moving to Richard and the other Caldwells. It was a subtle hierarchy established through the ritual of wine service that communicated volumes about the new power dynamic at the table. Sarah noticed how Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she accepted her glass, the tremor causing the expensive liquid to slosh dangerously close to the rim. Richard's eyes darted nervously between Dominic and his associates, who remained stationed near the door, their relaxed postures belying their constant vigilance. William had lost his earlier smugness, now studying Dominic with a mixture of wariness and the reluctant respect of someone who recognizes a superior predator. "A toast," Dominic announced, raising his glass with a gesture that commanded attention without being ostentatious. "To my sister and her husband. May your marriage be blessed with happiness, prosperity, and respect." He emphasized the last word, his gaze sweeping meaningfully around the table, the message unmistakable to everyone present. Everyone drank, the Caldwells with visible discomfort, the expensive wine likely tasting of fear rather than fruit and oak on their tongues. James met Sarah's eyes over his glass, a new understanding passing between them. Something had shifted in her husband's perception, not just of Dominic, but of Sarah herself. He was seeing her through new eyes, recognizing dimensions to her background and family that he had perhaps deliberately avoided examining too closely. "Now," Dominic said, setting down his glass and leaning forward slightly, his body language both relaxed and commanding the space around him. "Sarah tells me you're in banking, Richard. Investment, correct? Caldwell Financial has been around for what? 3 generations." Richard straightened slightly, his shoulders squaring as he moved onto familiar territory. Banking was his domain, the world where he commanded respect and wielded influence. "That's right," he confirmed, his voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. "Caldwell Financial was founded by my grandfather in 1928, just before the crash. We survived when many others didn't." There was undisguised pride in his voice, the satisfaction of old money that had weathered financial storms and emerged stronger. "We've been a fixture in Boston's financial district for 3 generations." "Impressive," Dominic nodded, seeming genuinely interested rather than merely polite. Sarah knew her brother well enough to recognize when he was gathering information, filing away details that might prove useful later. "Family businesses are the backbone of this country. Our father understood that. He built something from nothing when he came to America with just $50 sewn into the lining of his coat. The detail about the $50 was a family legend, one their father had recounted countless times over Sunday dinners, how he had arrived at 17, speaking broken English, but with determination and dreams of providing a better life for the family he would one day have. How he had worked 18-hour days, unloading ships at the Providence docks, saving every penny until he could open a tiny storefront, selling imported Italian foods to homesick immigrants who longed for tastes of the old country. Dominic looked directly at Elizabeth, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably in her designer dress. Not quaint at all, really, quite an achievement. Elizabeth paled, the color draining from her carefully made-up face as she realized Dominic had overheard her earlier comment about the quaint grocery store. The realization that he had been present, or had been informed, long enough to witness their condescension towards Sarah seemed to dawn on all the Caldwells simultaneously. "Of course," Elizabeth stammered, her usual poise deserting her. "I didn't mean to imply—" "No need to explain," Dominic cut her off smoothly, his voice pleasant but with an edge that made Elizabeth shrink back slightly in her chair. "I'm sure you meant no disrespect to our family's humble beginnings." His smile remained fixed, but there was a hardness in his eyes that made Elizabeth reach for her wineglass and take a large, unladylike gulp. After all, most great American fortunes began with someone willing to work hard and take risks, didn't they, Richard? Richard nodded stiffly, clearly attempting to redirect the conversation to safer ground. Indeed, enterprise and determination are values the Caldwell family has always respected. William, either missing the underlying tension or choosing to ignore it in a display of the arrogance that had defined him throughout dinner, let out a short laugh that echoed too loudly in the now attentive restaurant. Banking's a bit different from running a grocery store, though, isn't it? Different leagues entirely. He reached for his wineglass with the casual entitlement of someone who had never had to consider the consequences of his words. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Even the ambient sounds of silverware against plates from nearby tables quieted, as if the entire restaurant held its collective breath. Dominic's associates by the door straightened almost imperceptibly, their relaxed postures giving way to a more alert stance that wouldn't be noticeable to the untrained eye, but that Sarah recognized immediately as a shift to readiness. Different scales, perhaps, Dominic acknowledged, his voice dangerously soft as he set down his wineglass with precise control. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, like a predator, assessing whether its prey was worth the effort of pursuit. But similar principles at their core. You need to understand people's needs, build trust, maintain relationships. His dark eyes fixed on William with an intensity that finally seemed to penetrate the younger man's arrogance. "Protect what's yours." William's smug smile faltered under Dominic's steady gaze. "And, of course," Dominic continued, his tone conversational, but carrying an underlying edge that raised the fine hairs on Sarah's arms, "consequences must be swift when agreements are broken or respect is not shown. I imagine banking has similar principles, doesn't it, Richard?" Richard cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence that had fallen. "In a manner of speaking," he conceded, shooting a warning glance at his elder son that came several minutes too late to prevent the damage. Sarah felt James's hand squeeze hers under the table, a silent signal of support that she found surprisingly comforting. Her husband was beginning to understand the complexity of the world she came from, the unspoken rules and dangerous currents that she had tried to leave behind when she married into the Caldwell family. "Speaking of respect," Dominic continued, turning his attention back to Sarah, his expression warming as he addressed his sister. "I heard something interesting when I walked in, something about the pronunciation of Italian wines." He glanced at William, one eyebrow raised in mock curiosity. "Perhaps you'd like to share your expertise on the subject. I'm always eager to learn from those knowledgeable in areas like fine wine and social graces." The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable, the challenge direct. William suddenly became very interested in his napkin, avoiding Dominic's penetrating gaze. "I was just making conversation," he muttered. His earlier confidence evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. "My sister grew up speaking 2 languages," Dominic said, his tone conversational, but with a fierce undercurrent of pride and protection that made Sarah's heart constrict with complicated emotion. Our mother insisted on it. Italian at home, English everywhere else. Sarah was reading Dante in the original text, while most kids were still struggling with Dr. Seuss. He smiled at his sister, a genuine expression that momentarily stripped away the hardened exterior to reveal the brother she had idolized growing up. Always the smart one in the family, Dad used to say she got all the brains and I got all the other qualities. The deliberate vagueness of other qualities hung in the air, allowing the Caldwells' imaginations to fill in the blanks with whatever criminal attributes they most feared. It was a masterful bit of intimidation through implication, something Sarah had watched her brother perfect over the years. Sarah felt a rush of affection for Dominic, despite her misgivings about his presence and the unmistakable threat he represented to the careful separation she had tried to maintain between her past and present lives. Dominic had always been her fiercest defender, even when she wished he wouldn't be. Even when his protection came with complications and consequences she would rather avoid. "Sarah is an excellent teacher," James said suddenly, finding his voice for the first time since Dominic's arrival. There was a new firmness in his tone, a conviction that had been absent during the earlier parts of the evening when his parents had subtly demeaned his wife. "She has a gift with children. The way she connects with her students is remarkable. They adore her, and their parents constantly request her class." He straightened his shoulders slightly, looking directly at his father as he continued. "My family may not always show it, but we do recognize how fortunate I am to have married her." The words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of allegiance that Sarah hadn't expected. James had always been caught in the middle, loving his wife but unwilling to openly defy his family's expectations and prejudices. His statement now, in front of everyone, felt like a turning point, a small act of courage that meant more to Sarah than any grand gesture could have. Dominic's gaze shifted to James, assessing him anew as if seeing beyond the surface of the privileged architect from Beacon Hill to something more substantial underneath. "Is that so?" he asked quietly, his tone neither confrontational nor fully accepting, simply evaluating. James met his gaze directly for the first time that evening, the architect's usual reticence giving way to surprising conviction. "Yes, and I should have said so earlier." He turned to Sarah, genuine remorse in his eyes. "I apologize, Sarah. I should have spoken up when my family was being disrespectful." The sincerity in his voice made Sarah's heart twist with complicated emotions. Gratitude for his belated support, lingering hurt from his earlier silence, and a renewed hope for what their marriage could be if he continued to find his voice. She reached for his hand under the table, squeezing it in silent acknowledgement. "Well," Dominic said, leaning back in his chair, his posture relaxing slightly, though his eyes remained alert and assessing. "That's good to hear." He swirled the wine in his glass, the motion practiced and elegant. "Family should stand up for each other, don't you think, Richard?" Richard nodded stiffly, his expression suggesting he was mentally calculating the potential costs of this unexpected dinner connection, both financial and social. "Of course." "I've always believed that," Dominic continued, the simple statement carrying the weight of his reputation and the implied consequences for anyone who violated that principle. "Family comes first. It's something our parents taught us from the cradle." He placed his hand over Sarah's free one, a gesture of sibling affection that also served as a visible claim. "Which is why I'm personally invested in my sister's happiness." The words "personally invested" carried a depth of meaning beyond their surface simplicity, an implied warning that the Caldwells couldn't miss. Sarah watched as Richard's professional demeanor faltered slightly, revealing a flash of genuine concern before he managed to restore his composed expression. "She chose to join your family, which means I consider you all under my protection now. An extension of my own family, you might say." Dominic's smile was pleasant, even warm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath. "In our tradition, once bonds of family are established, they're sacred, permanent." The implications of being under Dominic Ricci's protection were not lost on anyone at the table. Elizabeth's face had gone completely white. The color drained from her usually composed features, as if the blood had retreated from her skin in primal fear. Richard looked as though he might need medical attention, his breathing slightly labored as he processed the full meaning of what Dominic was saying. William and Vanessa had both gone perfectly still, as if afraid that any movement might draw unwanted attention. "That's very generous," Richard managed, his voice strained despite his obvious effort to maintain composure. "Not at all," Dominic waved dismissively, the gesture causing his French cuff to reveal a glimpse of a gold cufflink bearing the Ricci family crest, a lion rampant that Sarah recognized as a copy of the one their father had worn. "It's what family does. We take care of our own." He took another appreciative sip of the Brunello, savoring it with the unhurried enjoyment of a man who knew no one would dare interrupt him or rush his pleasure. "And since we're family now, I hope you'll all join us next Sunday at our mother's house for dinner. She makes a ragout that simmers for 8 hours. There's nothing like it in all of New England." Sarah stared at her brother in disbelief, momentarily forgetting her annoyance at his unexpected appearance. He was inviting the Caldwells to their mother's weekly family dinner, an intimate gathering that had been a constant in their lives since childhood, a sacred tradition that had continued even after their father's death. Sunday dinner at Rosa Ricci's modest but immaculate home in the heart of Federal Hill was reserved for blood relatives and a very select few outsiders who had earned complete trust. The table would be laden with antipasti, homemade pasta, meats that had been cooking since dawn, and desserts that Rosa started preparing days in advance. The wine would flow freely, stories would be told and retold, arguments would erupt and be resolved, all under the watchful eyes of family photographs and the small shrine to St. Anthony that Rosa maintained in the corner of her dining room. The thought of the Caldwells with their designer clothes and carefully curated manners, sitting at that worn wooden table, surrounded by Ricci cousins, uncles and family friends, was so incongruous that Sarah almost laughed aloud. "We wouldn't want to impose," Elizabeth began, her social training taking over despite her obvious discomfort. Sarah recognized the polite deflection for what it was, an attempt to avoid entering a world that Elizabeth both feared and undoubtedly considered beneath her social standing. "Nonsense," Dominic insisted, his pleasant tone belied by the resolute set of his jaw. "My mother has been asking to meet you properly. The wedding was such a blur, and we've had too few opportunities to get acquainted since then." He smiled at Elizabeth with practiced charm. "Sunday dinners are a tradition in our family. Food, wine, conversation, the true Italian experience. I won't take no for an answer." His smile was pleasant, but his tone made it clear this was not an invitation but a command. Sarah recognized the subtle power play for what it was. Dominic was establishing dominance, making it clear that the Caldwells would now adapt to his terms rather than the other way around. It was a complete reversal of the dynamic that had defined her relationship with her in-laws for the past 2 years. Richard, ever the pragmatist and clearly sensing the wisdom of compliance, nodded quickly. "We'd be honored." "Excellent," Dominic said, standing suddenly with the fluid grace of a much younger man. He rebuttoned his suit jacket with practiced ease, the motion drawing attention to its perfect fit and the subtle power in his shoulders and chest. "I've taken enough of your celebration time. Enjoy your dinner." He leaned down to kiss Sarah's cheek again, his familiar scent, expensive cologne with undertones of the cigars he occasionally smoked, enveloping her. "Happy anniversary, little sister. The first 2 years are just the beginning." He straightened and turned to James, extending his hand. "James, take care of her." The words were soft, but the warning in them was clear. "I will," James promised, and Sarah could see he meant it. Dominic straightened, buttoning his jacket. "The dinner is taken care of," he told Richard. "Consider it my anniversary gift." "That's not necessary," Richard began. "I insist," Dominic said firmly. With a final nod to the table, he rejoined his associates and made his way out of the restaurant, stopping to speak briefly with the owner on his way out. A collective breath seemed to be released at the table as the door closed behind them. "Well," Elizabeth said, her voice higher than usual, "your brother seems devoted to you." Sarah sipped her wine, unsure whether to be mortified or amused by the entire situation. "Dominic is very protective," she said simply. "You never mentioned your family was so connected," William said, unable to keep the nervous awe from his voice. "You never asked," Sarah replied. You were too busy talking about your golf handicap and your summer house in the Hamptons. James let out a startled laugh, quickly covering it with a cough when his mother shot him a shocked look. Sarah, Elizabeth began reprovingly. I think, James interrupted, that we owe Sarah an apology. All of us. He looked directly at his mother. We haven't been welcoming or respectful, and that changes today. Richard cleared his throat. James is right. Sarah, we may have misjudged some things. Sarah could see the calculation behind Richard's eyes, the sudden revaluation of her worth, now that he understood her family connections. It wasn't genuine respect, but fear was an effective substitute for now. I appreciate that, Richard, she said, and I look forward to all of you joining us for Sunday dinner. My mother is a wonderful cook, and family means everything to her. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Everything. The waiter approached with their appetizers, moving with the careful precision of someone who had been warned to provide impeccable service. Compliments of Mr. Ricci, he said, as he set down an additional plate of calamari that hadn't been ordered. James raised his wine glass. To family, he said, looking directly at Sarah with new understanding in his eyes. To family, the others echoed, their voices subdued but sincere. Sarah raised her own glass, thinking of her brother driving back to Providence, of her mother who would be delighted to host the Caldwells, despite what Sarah had told her about them, of her father who had worked himself to exhaustion to provide opportunities for his children. To family, she agreed, in all its complicated forms. As the evening progressed, Sarah noticed a subtle shift in the Caldwells' behavior. Elizabeth asked genuine questions about Sarah's teaching career, how she had decided to work with kindergartners, what strategies she used to engage young learners, whether she found it rewarding. For the first time, Elizabeth seemed to be considering that educating 5-year-olds might require skill and dedication rather than being a simplistic occupation for those unable to secure more prestigious positions. Richard inquired about her favorite books, seeming genuinely surprised when Sarah mentioned her love for both classic Italian literature and contemporary American fiction. I've always enjoyed Umberto Eco, he admitted, though I needed the translated version, of course. The small self-deprecating joke was unprecedented, a tiny crack in the facade of Caldwell superiority. William and Vanessa remained quiet but respectful, the earlier mockery replaced by a watchful politeness that, while not warm, was a significant improvement. And James held her hand openly on the table now, his thumb tracing small circles on her skin, his eyes filled with something that looked like admiration and renewed interest when he glanced her way. "Tell me about the store your father ran," he asked as they waited for dessert, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than the polite obligation that had characterized many of their early dating conversations. "You've mentioned it, but I realized I've never asked for details." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the excellent wine. Ricci's Market started as a small grocery on Atwell's Avenue in Federal Hill, just a narrow storefront with shelves of imported pasta, olive oil, and canned tomatoes. My grandfather opened it in 1948, and my father took it over in the 70s. The memories came flooding back as she spoke, the rich smells of cheeses and cured meats, the musical cadence of Italian being spoken by elderly men who gathered at the small table in the back to play cards and argue politics, the way her father would let her arrange the fruit displays when she was small. Dad expanded it gradually, adding a wine section, then a deli counter, then imported ceramics and linens. "And you worked there?" James asked. Sarah nodded, surprised by how much she enjoyed sharing this part of her history, now that she wasn't afraid of it being judged as inferior. "Every summer from age 14 until I went to college. I started stocking shelves, then worked the register, and eventually helped with ordering. Dominic worked there too, though he was more interested in deliveries and the wholesale side of things. The unspoken subtext, that deliveries and wholesale, had provided the connections that facilitated Dominic's eventual shift into less legitimate businesses, hung in the air, acknowledged, but not directly addressed. "I'd like to see it sometime," James said, his voice soft but sincere. "The original store, if that would be okay with you." The simple request touched Sarah deeply, a genuine desire to understand her roots rather than avoid or minimize them. "I'd like that," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Maybe we can go after Sunday dinner. It's just a few blocks from my mother's house." As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a curious sense of transformation. The evening had begun with her feeling like an outsider in her husband's world, enduring subtle mockery and condescension from his family. It was ending with the Caldwells treating her with newfound respect, motivated by fear perhaps, but respect nonetheless, and James showing a genuine interest in the background she had often downplayed to fit into his world. Tomorrow, Sarah would call Dominic and scold him for interfering. She would remind him that she could fight her own battles, that she had left Providence precisely to escape the long shadow of the Ricci name and all it implied in certain circles. She would make him promise to be on his best behavior on Sunday, to show the Caldwells that there was more to their family than intimidation and power plays. But tonight, just for tonight, Sarah allowed herself to enjoy the newfound respect in her in-laws' eyes, the warmth of the exquisite wine her brother had provided, and the knowledge that, for better or worse, no one would ever mock her heritage again. Outside Pellegrino's, Dominic Ricci slid into the back seat of a black Mercedes S-Class, the vehicle's understated luxury matching his preference for power without ostentatious display. He loosened his tie slightly, the only indication that he was relaxing his public persona now that he was among his most trusted associates. Marco, his cousin and most trusted lieutenant, got in beside him while Anthony took the driver's seat and Sal rode shotgun, their positions as automatic and choreographed as a ballet they had performed countless times. "Everything go okay in there, Dom?" Marco asked once the doors were closed, creating their private bubble within the plush leather interior. At 35, Marco was close enough to Dominic's age to speak with the familiarity of a peer rather than the deference of a subordinate. They had grown up together, cousins so close they were more like brothers, sharing skinned knees as children, and eventually more dangerous wounds as adults. Dominic smiled, thinking of the look of pride he'd seen return to his sister's eyes when he put the Caldwells in their place. "Just a family dinner," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Nothing to worry about." Marco snorted softly, unconvinced by the nonchalance. "That banker looked like he was about to have a heart attack when you invited them to Aunt Rosa's for Sunday dinner. You know she'll have a fit when she finds out you invited those people without asking her first." "Mama will be fine once I explain," Dominic said. Though he knew there would indeed be a lecture about proper notice for adding guests to Sunday dinner, his mother ran her kitchen with military precision, planning meals days in advance and taking enormous pride in her reputation as the best cook in Federal Hill. She's been wanting to meet Sarah's in-laws properly anyway, and it'll give her an excuse to make her special lasagna. "The one with the bechamel?" Sal asked from the front seat, momentarily distracted from his vigilant assessment of the street outside. "Man, I love that lasagna." "You're not invited, Sal," Dominic said, though they all knew that Rosa Ricci's table was always open to Dominic's inner circle, who were treated as extended family, regardless of blood relation. "This is strictly family. The Caldwells aren't family," Marco pointed out, his natural protectiveness extending to anyone bearing the Ricci name. "They treat Sarah like she's beneath them. I've heard how they talk to her when they visit her school for events." Dominic's eyes narrowed at this previously unmentioned intelligence. "You've been keeping an eye on Sarah's in-laws?" Marco shrugged unapologetically. "You asked me to check in on her occasionally. Make sure she's okay. Those stuck-up Boston types weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for her." Dominic nodded, unsurprised but still irritated by the confirmation of what he had suspected. Sarah had always been independent, determined to make her own way without relying on the Ricci name or connections. It was why she had gone away to college in Boston rather than staying in Providence, why she had pursued teaching rather than working in the family business, why she had fallen in love with an architect from a world so different from their own. Dominic respected her choices, even when they diverged from the path he would have preferred for her. But respect for her independence didn't mean he would allow anyone to disrespect her, especially not a family of banking elites who thought their generations of inherited wealth made them superior to the daughter of an Italian immigrant grocer. The car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the Boston night traffic. Anthony navigated with the confidence of someone who had driven these streets many times before, heading toward the highway that would take them back to Providence. Dominic gazed out at the passing city lights, considering the evening's events and their implications. Sunday would be interesting, he thought. His mother would fuss and feed everyone until they couldn't move. His aunts would pinch James's cheeks and declare him too skinny. His uncles would tell embarrassing stories about Sarah's childhood. His cousins would ask invasive personal questions with the directness that characterized the Ricci family gatherings. And the Caldwells would learn what family really meant, not the sterile, status-conscious connections they cultivated in their Beacon Hill world, but the messy, loyal, sometimes overwhelming bonds that had defined the Ricci clan for generations. Sarah had chosen her path, and Dominic respected that. She had worked hard to create a life separate from the family business, to build a career based on her own talents rather than trading on the Ricci name. She had married for love rather than advantage or connection, choosing a man whose gentle nature and creative mind were antithetical to the hard-edged world Dominic inhabited. But some things, like the bonds of blood and the protection it entailed, could never truly be escaped. The Caldwells would understand that soon enough. They would learn that their banking connections and social status meant little in the face of the deeper power that came from true family loyalty. They would discover that their polite society rules were superficial compared to the unwritten code that governed families like the Ricci's. As Boston's light streamed past the car windows, creating patterns of illumination and shadow across his features, Dominic made a mental note to have someone look more closely into Caldwell Financial's operations, just as a precaution, just to make sure his sister's future was secure. Not because he intended to interfere in her life, Sarah would never forgive that kind of direct intervention, but because knowledge was power, and Dominic believed in being prepared for all contingencies. Make sure Giuseppe sends a proper thank you note for his nephew's new restaurant permit, Dominic said to Marco, who immediately made a note in his phone. And have someone keep an eye on the Caldwells this week, discreetly. I want to know if they're genuinely planning to show up on Sunday, or if they might be thinking of finding an excuse. You think they'd risk insulting you by not showing? Marco asked, surprise evident in his voice. Dominic shrugged. People with money often think they're untouchable, that the rules don't apply to them. I want to make sure they understand this isn't optional. Consider it done, Marco replied with the efficiency that made him indispensable. Dominic returned his gaze to the passing cityscape, satisfaction settling over him. He had seen the renewed confidence in his sister's eyes tonight, the straightening of her shoulders when the balance of power shifted, the subtle reclaiming of her identity as a Ricci, even as she remained James Caldwell's wife. That alone made the evening worthwhile. The family dinner on Sunday would cement what tonight had begun, a recalibration of Sarah's position in her married life, an acknowledgement of her worth and background, and perhaps most importantly, a clear understanding that while Sarah had chosen to join the Caldwell family, she would always be a Ricci at heart. And the Riccis took care of their own. After all, that's what family did for each other. It was the principle his father had lived by, the legacy Dominic had inherited, along with the grocery business and the other less legitimate operations. Family first. Family always, no matter what. Dominic settled back against the leather seat as the car accelerated onto the highway, heading south toward Providence. He would call Sarah tomorrow, listen patiently to her lecture about interference and boundaries, promise to be on his best behavior on Sunday, and then do exactly what needed to be done to ensure his little sister received the respect she deserved. Just as he always had. Some things never changed, and some bonds, like the one between a protective older brother and his beloved sister, were simply unbreakable.